I lived carefully. That's how I explained my life to myself. Carefully meant responsibly. Thoughtfully. Without unnecessary risks. Carefully meant not making mistakes that couldn't be undone. Carefully meant choosing what made sense instead of what felt uncertain. For a long time, that sounded like wisdom. Only later did I understand what it really was. Fear with good manners. There was never a moment where my life collapsed or forced me to wake up. Nothing dramatic happened. No single failure pointed at me and said, "This is where you went wrong." My life worked. That was the problem. It worked so well that it never demanded courage from me. It allowed me to move forward without asking uncomfortable questions. It rewarded consistency, patience, and restraint. I built a life that didn't require me to be brave, only careful. At first, I thought that was maturity. I watched other people take risks, make impulsive decisions, chase things that weren't guaranteed. Some of them failed loudly. Some of them succeeded unexpectedly. I told myself I was smarter for waiting, for thinking things through, for not gambling with my future. I believed that if I moved slowly enough, I could avoid regret. I didn't realize that moving slowly was already shaping it. Years passed quietly. Not empty years, full ones. Schedules, responsibilities, obligations. I was busy enough to feel productive, stable enough to feel secure. When people asked how I was doing, I could answer honestly, fine. I wasn't lying. I just wasn't telling the whole truth. The truth was harder to name. It lived in small moments so subtle I almost ignored them. A hesitation before answering simple questions. A dull feeling after achieving something I had worked toward. A strange distance between what I was doing and what I felt. I told myself those things were normal. Everyone compromises. Everyone settles. Everyone learns to be realistic. That's what I told myself. Carefulness became my identity. I avoided paths that required too much uncertainty. I delayed decisions until they felt safe. I chose options that could be defended logically, explained easily, justified to others. I became very good at justification. If something didn't excite me, I called it stability. If something felt empty, I called it peace. If something scared me, I called it irresponsible. I translated fear into maturity. And nobody questioned it, not even me. The strange thing about living carefully is that it doesn't feel like avoidance while you're doing it. It feels like control. Like you're managing your life instead of letting it manage you. But control has a cost. It narrows your world slowly, politely, without resistance. It turns possibility into planning and desire into risk assessment. It teaches you to value safety over truth. I stopped asking myself what I wanted. Not consciously. The question just faded. Wanting things felt dangerous. It complicated choices. It created tension between what felt right and what was reasonable. So I trained myself not to want too much. I became adaptable instead. Adaptability looks like strength from the outside. People praised my reliability, my patience, my ability to handle things calmly. They trusted me because I didn't demand much. I didn't disrupt anything. I mistook that trust for belonging. Inside, something was going quiet. I didn't feel miserable. That would have been easier to confront. Misery demands change. Pain insists on attention. What I felt was dullness. A soft, persistent sense that I was living one step removed from my own experiences. That my life was happening in front of me, not inside me. That I was present enough to function, but absent enough not to feel deeply. Carefulness had protected me from mistakes. It had also protected me from meaning. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, during ordinary days. Days that looked fine on the outside but left nothing behind on the inside. I began to notice how rarely my days felt memorable, not because nothing happened, but because nothing required me to show up fully. I could perform my life without being inside it. That scared me. I started thinking about time in a way I never had before. Not in deadlines or schedules, but in chances. Chances to choose differently. Chances to speak honestly. Chances to step into uncertainty. I realized how many of those chances I had let pass because waiting felt safer. Waiting felt careful. But waiting had consequences. One evening, alone, I tried to remember the last time I had done something, not because it was smart or acceptable, but because it felt necessary. Because it felt alive. I couldn't remember. That silence in my memory terrified me more than any failure ever could have. I understood then that I hadn't ruined my life. I had minimized it. Carefulness had slowly turned into confinement. Not imposed by anyone else, chosen by me. Reinforced every time I decided that safety mattered more than presence. And the worst part, there was no one to blame. No villain. No catastrophe. No excuse. Just years of reasonable decisions that quietly added up to a life I didn't recognize as my own. That night, a thought settled into me with unbearable clarity: if I keep living carefully, I will never know who I could have been. Not because I failed, but because I never dared to find out. And once that thought appeared, I couldn't push it away. Because careful living doesn't collapse dramatically. It erodes you gently until one day, you realize the life you protected so well never truly belonged to you. Once I realized that careful living had cost me more than it protected me from, I didn't suddenly change. I hesitated. Because hesitation was familiar. It was the language I had spoken my entire life. I tried to reason with myself the way I always had. I told myself that it wasn't that bad. That every life involves compromise, that meaning is overrated, and stability is underrated. That I was lucky and that wanting more would make me ungrateful. Those arguments were convincing. They always had been. But something inside me had shifted, and now those explanations felt thin. Not wrong, just incomplete. Like answers to a different question than the one I was finally asking. The question wasn't whether my life was acceptable. It was whether it was inhabited. I started noticing how often I lived in anticipation instead of presence. Anticipating the end of the workday. Anticipating the weekend. Anticipating the next phase, the next milestone, the next version of myself who would finally feel ready. My life existed mostly in the future. The present was something I passed through. That scared me. Because the future I kept imagining never actually arrived. It kept moving further away, replaced by another future, and then another. Meanwhile, the present thinned out until it felt almost transparent. I wasn't unhappy. I was postponing myself. I began to feel tension where there hadn't been any before. Not anxiety, pressure. The pressure of knowing that staying careful was no longer neutral. That every day I continued like this, I was actively choosing restraint over truth. Carefulness started to feel like avoidance with a respectable name. That realization brought fear. Not fear of failing, fear of losing what I had built. Because careful living had given me things. A reputation. Predictability. A version of myself that people trusted and relied on. I knew how to exist inside that structure. I knew the rules. Risk threatened all of it. If I chose differently now, what would that say about the years I had already lived? What would it mean to admit that patience had turned into fear, that wisdom had become caution for its own sake? I felt loyalty to my past self. That loyalty kept me stuck. I had built my identity around being the one who didn't disrupt things. The one who adjusted. The one who accepted. Walking away from that identity felt like betrayal, not just of others, but of myself. So I stayed careful. But staying careful started to hurt. Not dramatically. Quietly. in ways that were easy to ignore if I didn't look too closely. A dull restlessness I couldn't explain. A fatigue that sleep didn't fix. A sense that my emotions were slightly delayed, as if they had to pass through a filter before reaching me. I began to feel disconnected from my own reactions. Joy arrived muted. Disappointment barely registered. Everything felt safe. Too safe. I realized then that careful living had slowly trained me not to feel deeply. Deep feeling leads to deep wanting. Deep wanting leads to risk. I had learned how not to want. That realization hit me harder than any fear of failure. Because it meant I wasn't just avoiding mistakes. I was avoiding myself. I tried to imagine my life continuing exactly as it was. Not worse. Not better. Just the same rhythms, the same restraint, the same careful distance from anything that might destabilize me. The image felt unbearable. Not because it was painful. Because it was empty. I understood something then that I had never fully allowed myself to see: careful living doesn't stop regret. It just delays it until it becomes heavier, quieter, and harder to escape. I wasn't afraid of making the wrong choice anymore. I was afraid of never making one. That fear changed everything. It made staying feel dangerous. It stripped carefulness of its moral authority. It exposed it for what it had become: a habit, not a value. A defense, not a principle. I realized that if I continued to live carefully, I wouldn't implode. I would fade. I would wake up one day older, calmer, still functioning and completely unsure where my life had gone. I would have memories, not experiences. Explanations, not stories. And no one would blame me. That was the most frightening part. I reached a point where I understood something with painful clarity: the greatest risk in my life was not failure. It was caution. Caution had already taken years from me without leaving visible damage. It had shaped my days gently, politely, without resistance. It had turned my life into something manageable instead of meaningful. And now it was asking for more. I didn't know yet how to stop living carefully. I only knew that continuing to do so would cost me everything I couldn't name but deeply needed. The conflict inside me sharpened into a single, unbearable truth: if I waited for certainty, I would wait forever. And time would continue to decide for me. The moment careful living finally broke wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. I didn't wake up brave. I woke up unwilling. Unwilling to keep negotiating my life down to something safe enough to survive but too small to inhabit. For the first time, caution didn't feel wise. It felt expensive. I understood then that carefulness had become a habit, not a value. A reflex I used to avoid discomfort. A shield I hid behind so I wouldn't have to risk disappointment or worse, responsibility. Responsibility for choosing. I had spent years believing that if I moved carefully enough, I could protect myself from regret. But what I had really done was trade visible mistakes for invisible losses. Losses that didn't announce themselves. Losses that accumulated quietly while everything looked fine. That realization hurt more than any failure ever had. Because it meant there was no moment I could point to and say, this is when it went wrong. There was only a pattern: years of hesitation, restraint, and waiting that had slowly shaped my life without my consent. Carefulness had trained me to tolerate distance from myself. I didn't want to tolerate it anymore. The decision itself was small. Almost embarrassing in how ordinary it looked. I didn't quit everything. I didn't disappear. I didn't reinvent myself into someone fearless. I interrupted the pattern. I chose something uncertain over something familiar. I said yes where I had always delayed. I said no where I had always accommodated. I allowed myself to feel discomfort without immediately trying to neutralize it. That felt reckless to my nervous system. My body didn't trust it. My mind panicked. Every internal alarm told me I was making a mistake, that I was destabilizing something that had taken years to build. But beneath that panic, there was something else. Relief. Not happiness. Not confidence. Relief that I was finally inside my own decision. The days that followed were harder than I expected. Without carefulness as a buffer, everything felt sharper. Time slowed because I was present. Choices had consequences because I was choosing them. Even silence felt heavier because it belonged to me now. I grieved immediately. Grieved the years I had minimized. The chances I had delayed until they disappeared. The versions of my life that would never exist because I had waited too long to meet them. That grief was unavoidable. And for the first time, I didn't try to talk myself out of it. I didn't reframe it as growth. I didn't soften it with lessons. I didn't hide behind gratitude or logic. I let it hurt. Because grief is the price of realizing something mattered. I learned that careful living doesn't prevent pain. It postpones it. And postponed pain grows heavier with time. I began to see how deeply caution had shaped my identity. How much of who I thought I was came from avoiding risk. How often I confused being reasonable with being absent. How skilled I had become at explaining my life instead of living it. Letting go of that identity was terrifying. Carefulness had given me approval. Predictability. A version of myself that others trusted and relied on. Stepping away from it meant becoming unfamiliar to them and to me. Some relationships changed. Some expectations dissolved. Some doors closed without drama. I let them close. Not because it was easy. Because keeping them open required me to stay small. I stopped asking whether I could make up for lost time. That question only leads backward. Instead, I ask something simpler and more demanding: am I choosing this day, or am I tolerating it some days? I didn't like the answer. But honesty did something careful living never had. It gave my life weight. Days stopped blending together. Moments left marks. Even mistakes felt meaningful because they were mine. I wasn't just managing outcomes anymore, I was participating. I realized something essential during that period: a careful life can look successful and still be unfinished. Because success without presence is just continuity. I didn't become fearless. Fear still visits me regularly. Doubt still asks questions. Uncertainty still unsettles me. The difference is that they no longer decide for me. Carefulness no longer has authority over my life. Choice does. I learned that meaning doesn't come from avoiding mistakes. It comes from accepting responsibility for the fact that every life costs something and deciding what you're willing to pay. I paid with regret for waiting. Now, I pay with uncertainty. Uncertainty is lighter. If there is a final confession in this story, it's this: I lived carefully because I was afraid of choosing wrong. And in doing so, I almost missed my own life. I can't get back what carefulness took from me. There is no way to reclaim years spent waiting. Some doors closed while I stood still. Some versions of myself will never exist. I carry that. But I carry it awake. I no longer confuse safety with truth. I no longer confuse patience with avoidance. I no longer confuse careful living with a meaningful one. I choose imperfectly, sometimes clumsily, often without guarantees. But I choose. And after a lifetime of caution, that is the first real sign that I am finally living my own life.